Ruth, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Nancy. It's good to be here again.
Now, last time we really explored the whole idea of how thoughts can both heal us and how our thoughts hurt us. So we want to continue to understand, where do these thoughts come from?
Seems to be a big mystery, but actually they come from our values. They come from our perceptions too, but we're going to talk about values right now. They come from our values. What we value is what we love, what we cherish, what we hate, what we fear. Those are very strong values. But they are those things that we are interested in.
So values are this kind of what we're attracted to and what we're not attracted to, what we put our energy into in a way.
Yes.
You know, what excites us and what disturbs us.
Yeah, well, yes, that's true, because it's what we cherish, hate, and fear. But we have an evolutionary hierarchy of values in metapsychiatry. These are values that are inherent in all of us, but they lead to also problems. So if we could go through the hierarchy of values, I think it would help us to understand where our problems come from and what would heal them.
Well, let's start at the top first with the thing that really will heal us, and then let's go back through the whole list.
That's a very good idea. Spiritual values, actually, are the only ones that do not have a flip side. They're only good. We call them non-dual values. And these are the optimum, highest values that are inherent in the universe. So values such as love and intelligence, which is, as we've said before, one of our favorite names for God. Values such as peace and harmony and joy, happiness, wisdom, understanding, vitality, all these values, these are not man-made. These exist already in the universe.
And something about when you say them, we all recognize them as things that we value and things that we want and things that we cherish and things that seem like, well, that would create heaven on earth, or that would be paradise, you know, if I could be happy, or if I had that kind of ease and wisdom and joy, that's what life is somehow supposed to be really like.
And that is what life really is like. But unfortunately, these values need to be brought out in us. We seem to need to cultivate an interest in them. They're lying dormant in all of us. They're inherent in all of us. But as I said, if they're not brought out by something or someone, if we're not educated to understand that they're there, we may not find them, or we may just find a few of them.
Well, when I think about joy or wisdom, you know, there's something inside that says, well, aren't we supposed to earn those? Don't we have to work towards those until they happen somehow?
Well, we have to work toward them in the sense that we have to be interested in them. We have to be interested in finding them and then in manifesting them in our lives. And we're not always interested. That's the sad truth. We're more interested in worldly values than we are in spiritual values. And that's why we run into problems, because worldly values have flip sides. There's a good part of it, and there are a normal part of it, and then there's the part that where we run into trouble if we become overly preoccupied with some of the worldly values.
Well, so they can't happen at the same time? We have to sort of go all or nothing? We have to just be all spiritual values and none of the other stuff?
Well, it's a process that happens gradually. The more we suffer, the more interested we are in spiritual values. So the less interested we would be in some of the worldly values when we realize that they actually are what creates the suffering for us.
Well, let's go through them, and maybe that'll help us understand what you're talking about.
I think that's a good idea. We could say on the lowest level of our awareness, or the lowest level of development, or the lowest level of consciousness, or whatever way you want to put it, it's not judgmental at all. It's just that we're seeking to understand those that are inherent in all of us, and we call those natural values. Natural because they take after nature and the animal kingdom, where the important thing for us is survival. So we're motivated by survival. Now that's an important thing, obviously. But if we can become overly preoccupied with survival, then we might become power mad. We're in danger, actually, of becoming power mad, because we would try to control others and thereby secure our own superiority. And we can run into trouble if we are living on that level.
Well, does that lead us into greed too? Because if we're concerned about survival, then we want to have a storehouse of things that we think are going to keep us alive.
That actually is a material value, but we'll
Okay.
get to that in a moment,
Okay,
because
great.
there's another one that comes before that, which we call hedonistic values.
Okay.
So hedonistic values are where we are interested in feeling good. Who doesn't like to feel good? You know, it's normal. But actually, we seek pleasure in order to avoid pain. So that's the flip side of it, that we run into problems trying to feel good, where we overdo it. And that's when we take up alcohol and drugs and too much sex, too much food, too much good stuff.
That's where
And
addictions come in, it sounds like.
That's right, and suffer the consequences. So if we're overly preoccupied with that, with feeling good, do it because it feels good, you know. You can do anything you like as long as it feels good. It must be right. Well, it must be right is a mistaken idea, because we suffer from that if we become overly interested in pursuing pleasure.
So that could be misinterpreted, I think, and probably it has been over the years, that, well, then you have to avoid all pleasure.
Oh, good
that
heavens.
pleasure is bad, but that's not what you're saying,
Oh,
is
no,
it?
of course not. Only if it becomes your preoccupation. If there's nothing else in your life but feeling good, then you're going to run into trouble.
If that's what we always value and that's what we pursue all the time, then it becomes a stumbling block.
Yes, yes. We suffer from it.
We
We
suffer
actually
from
hurt
it.
ourselves from it.
When we think our well-being is dependent on having that.
That's right, that's right. We could say that these evolutionary values are actually ways in which we try to find happiness. So we mistake what happiness really is, because we've already said it's a spiritual value. But if we don't know that, then we become more interested in the worldly values. Seems like happiness comes from pleasure. How could anybody argue with that? Happiness can be very pleasurable, but if it's a preoccupation and we're constantly seeking pleasure to find happiness, that's probably when we'll run into trouble.
Yeah, it seems more like if you're a happy person, then you're going to enjoy the pleasures of life.
Exactly.
But if you look for pleasure to make you happy, then you're going to suffer.
That's right.
Because it's never going to be able to really be the ultimate.
That's right. And it's never going to be enough.
No.
It doesn't answer. Something's missing, and we know that on some level. So that's not where to find happiness. But we try.
So what else? What other values
So
are there?
the material values come next. And that's where we are interested in having and holding on to things, acquiring things. And of course, this is important in our lives as well, so that we can see ourselves developing through this hierarchy. We become interested in making a good living. After all, that's an important thing. And until actually we establish a good economic base, we can't be interested in the higher values. So it's important. But again, what happens to us if we become preoccupied with having and holding on to things? We can suffer enormously if we have to give those up. So we can possess people, and if we have to give up an individual, that's very painful. Or if we're going through a divorce and we have to give up our home, that can be very painful. So, but there are other things that are material values that we're not aware of that also create problems, such as the interest in having degrees just for the sake of having a degree, or the interest in pursuing intellectual pursuits. So those can create problems for us. They can come into mental vanity, hubris. You know, that creates a problem for us.
That sounds like you're talking about status.
Yes,
and
status.
how we're seen in the world, that's somehow related to material values, what we value.
What we value, yes. So that can create a problem for us, as we know. Status, fame, all sorts of money, you know, the pursuit of money. That creates problems. If an individual is more interested in money than anything else, then they may completely ignore their family. They may find themselves having a lopsided life, that all that matters is the pursuit of money. So these can be troublesome.
So again, there's nothing wrong with being abundant or with being enjoying your work and enjoying being in the world, and that somehow is a value. But when our well-being kind of comes from that, when we overdo it, that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, yes. And actually, here's a principle that comes in that's a spiritual principle, the principle of affluence, which is the more outflow, the more inflow. And that's translated as the more that generosity, affection, and goodwill is allowed to flow freely through an individual, the more abundance there will be, the more affluence there will be. And that can include money, but it isn't specifically money. It's the good of God. It's the good of life that is going to be blessing us. So that stands, you see, in juxtaposition to material values.
Right. If we look to a material value to bring us into spiritual wholeness, it will never be able to do that.
No, it can't do it.
It can't
do it because happiness is not found in things.
Yes, it's just a completely different thing.
Yes.
But somehow our culture has mistaken in a way. We think that, oh, well, we'll be so wise if we have a PhD, or we'll be so joyful when we have a lot of money. But actually, those are two different values.
Yes, yes, and many people who have that PhD and have the fame and have the money are still unhappy.
Right.
So what is the meaning of that? You see, it's that they're not living yet enough by spiritual values, so they're suffering from that.
Yes, and people who want that, who don't have it, can also suffer. So it's not that whether you have it or not is what creates the happiness.
Where does the happiness come from?
That's what we want to understand.
Exactly. So happiness does not come from things, even though they can certainly be a blessing in our life to have them, of course. So the next level of values is called humanistic. And humanistic values have to do with social conscious, the betterment of society, seeking to be helpful in the world in beneficial ways, caring about others, justice, equality, all those humanistic values. So this is a good thing. This
now,
is
how
an
could
outgrowth.
that be a problem?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it could be, does it?
That's right. That's kind of what we want, right? Is for people to be good and generous and supportive and helpful and charitable.
Yes, yes, but it's motivated very often by the desire to influence, the desire to be right. So what can happen to us if we're desiring to be right? And let's say politics, this is politics, humanistic values or political values, democratic values, social welfare, social activism. How could that be troublesome?
Well, because we want the world to be the way we think it should be.
Exactly. So we're going to suffer from wanting that. But also, what does it do to somebody who is interested in influencing? For example, what does it do to a politician who becomes interested in his own well-being, in his own fame, and wanting to be known as being a good guy, let's say? What does that do to him?
Well, it can make them very controlling. It can become a workaholic in a way, and they can lose a lot of their own joy of life.
And they also tend to become more ambitious, and they lose the desire to be public servants. So if you see it from a spiritual perspective, that would be the motivation for being in politics, to be truly a public servant.
Right, to serve the needs of the whole.
Yes, yes, which is selfless.
Right.
Essentially, it's selfless. So it isn't motivated by wanting to influence and to be powerful and to be important. So
and probably many politicians or statespeople start that way. They really do want to serve.
Yes.
But somehow, along the way, then their own well-being, their own material benefit, their lifestyle, all the different elements of wanting to make an impact.
Yes.
And influence, as you were
to
saying.
Influence.
Lead us down a path that becomes a slippery slope, and we're all of a sudden suffering and maybe creating suffering for others.
Yes, and so we're corruptible.
Yes.
Right? So that's another problem that politics brings on, or anything in social activism.
Yes, because we want power then.
We want power. And the same with even something as lovely as volunteerism. It sounds like it's perfect, but there's a flip side to that too.
Oh, yes. You can't fire a volunteer.
You can't fire a volunteer. But also the volunteer is very often doing things that haven't been asked for.
That's right.
And so it's actually, acting in a superior way, and people feel they're not being valued, that they're being actually considered to be helpless. So we have to be careful if we're a volunteer that we don't fall prey to that tendency in us to want to, especially women, I think, who want to be nurturers and are natural at nurturing, but very often it's not asked for. So that's a danger to watch out for.
So even something as wonderful as wanting to be humanistic and wanting to care for others and influence others in a positive way can become troublesome and lead us into suffering.
Yes, believe it or not, it can. Even you can see it,
Yes,
can't you?
it's very clear. You're making it very clear. And so then, is there more?
Yes, another. Before we get to the spiritual values, there's one more. Religious values. I should have asked you, could you guess? Religious values. And of course, we appreciate religious values because this is where we have morals, and we appreciate that there is a desire to develop a conscience in an individual, to be concerned about others and what might be happening to them. So sharing is a very important value. But religious values also have a belief system. And there is a tendency to be interested in the dogma rather than perhaps interested in what it's really pointing to, which is the value, I think, is trying to be closer to God and to be here for God in a certain way, but perhaps misunderstood. So there's a lot of conflict in the world today because my God is better than your God, that kind of...
Right, my religious values are better than yours.
Than yours.
That's what we're fighting wars over.
Yes.
We've been fighting wars for thousands of years about that.
Yes, isn't that crazy?
It's insane.
Yes. So there's a problem with religion.
Yes.
But at least it's the highest of all human institutions, and we can be grateful for that. But we also have to see what the flip side is.
Right, and then what we really want there is to, like you said, develop a conscience and to understand how to interact, moral values.
Moral values.
Yeah, moral values.
Well, the moral values come from the Ten Commandments.
I see, okay. But then when it becomes a rigid rule or a rigid dogma that we have to defend against someone else who we think is wrong, then we're suffering, and we're creating suffering.
Yes, we're creating suffering because we're saying, my God has given me the right idea, and my God is telling me to do thus and so, and even killing in the name of God. I mean, it's absolute madness. So one has to say, what kind of a God are you talking about? You know, is this anthropomorphic image that we grew up with as children and we think is the Almighty, the Supreme Being, and what He says to us is what is right? How can a loving God be one who tells us to kill people? But you hear people saying, but God told me to do that.
So how does this get so mixed up? I mean, so we start with a good intention. We want to be good. We want to be moral. We want to enjoy the pleasures of life. But then they get all mixed up and we start to suffer, and we see that we've created suffering in other people that we care about.
Yes, yes, but of course this is ignorance. What we have mentioned before is that no one is to blame for this. It's just that we haven't been well educated to understand that our thoughts hurt us and hurt others, and that our thoughts come from what we value. So we have to be very careful to value spiritual values.
So just talk us through that, though. So how do thoughts relate to values, and how does that lead to suffering?
Well, thoughts are determined by our values.
Okay. Can you give me an example of that?
If you are living on the level of natural values, which knows not of God, it only knows of survival, and that has to be just me, myself alone, and what I need in order to survive.
I just want to get through the day. I just want to survive.
I just want to survive. Now you take that consciousness and you realize that that's coming from a very insecure and fearful place. And when we are insecure and fearful, we can do terrible things. We can do terrible things to ourselves and to others. We're going to hurt ourselves if we in fact destroy somebody else. But we're not aware that we're actually hurting ourselves. So
the value, I'm valuing survival. And so from that will come my thoughts.
Yes.
So when I look at a situation, when I look at, say, going into a store, I might look at, okay, so how is that going to serve my survival? And if I'm hungry, I might just take something, right? Because I'm in survival.
Exactly.
And that's what's most important. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's viewing life as a self. I'm here all by myself. There's nothing else but me. And I have to survive. Therefore, anything goes. Anything goes. Survival of the fittest. Kill or be killed. These are the laws of nature and the jungle.
So if something gets in my way, I can get angry. or I can get upset at it because what's important is survival.
Exactly. So just remember, though, that that comes from insecurity and fear. And that's an individual who knows not anything of omni-active love intelligence of God. So if you think you're all alone, of course you're going to react in that way. Survival above all costs. So you know not of omni-active love intelligence, which is always available to guide us in our lives.
So are you talking about that one as valuing being independent and being an individual? That's the natural value?
No. Natural value is just seeing life without God.
Okay.
Totally without God. So you're here all alone, and you have to survive on your own. There's nothing else, just me. And I have to produce everything myself. I have to control everything myself. Otherwise, somebody else is going to destroy me or control me.
Well, let's take another one that more is culturally that we might understand a little more, like materialistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that it's, who would argue with needing to make money and having as a value to have a certain lifestyle or financial income, that this is what we value.
And this is a good thing.
And this is
so
a
we're
good
not
thing.
saying that this is not a value
right.
that is helpful, but just to realize that we can become overly preoccupied with it, and then we will suffer as a result. As the example that I gave you before, for example, you lose your house. That's a very painful experience for many individuals.
Yes, so I'm trying to understand, how does valuing materialism,
Mm-hmm.
Material things, how does that create thought? Our thoughts come from what we value,
That's
right?
right. So if your interest is in having things, that's your thought. I have to have this.
Oh, I see. Okay. It's even very direct, you're saying.
It's very direct.
Yeah.
So I have to have this. If it's pleasure that I'm seeking, I have to have this. This is feeling good is the ultimate good in life. That's my thought. I must feel good at all costs.
So that's almost like the glasses, the shades that we see everything through.
It is the lens we see through.
It's the lens we see through.
Precisely.
Which is, I need material things are good, and that's what I want.
And that's the good of life. That's what gives me happiness,
right.
And therefore that is what I'm going to value above all values.
Right. Okay. So and we can begin to see that that's what leads to suffering.
That's right.
And conflict in the world.
And it's not only individual, it's with groups, it's with cultures, it's with society as a whole, it's with the world. That's the whole problem, is that we don't realize that we're valuing values that have a flip side. So let's take somebody who says, I really want to have peace. Okay? That sounds like the right idea.
Right.
But what kind of peace are they talking about? The absence of war? Is that real peace? It seems like it. But that's not real peace.
No.
Real peace is peace of mind. That comes from knowing that there is this higher consciousness, this higher intelligence, this higher love that is always available to us to protect us and to guide us in our lives.
But that can't possibly then be something we could create in a community.
Well, it can catch on. If one individual catches the idea, then of course we help each other to understand that that's real peace. And the more we can value real peace, the more it's impossible to have war. You can't fight anybody when you really understand that peace is a spiritual value, not a human value, not a humanistic value.
And when we really recognize spiritual value and what that's all about, we realize, I think one of the challenges is we realize that we can't make that happen. We can't do that. We can't say, okay, now let's go vote for spiritual values in the world. It just won't happen.
No, it's not something we can do. It's by the grace of God that we come to understand them. But we cultivate an interest in them, because that's what allows them to become known to us, when we become interested in them.
And is that something that we just grow into in our life?
Yes, we grow into it, but we also seem to need to have teachings that help us to understand that they are what they are, that defines them for us so that we can look for them. And I think that's one of the great values of metapsychiatry, is it helps us to understand these values. It defines them. So, for example, we define assurance not as certainty, in certainty, there's always doubt. The flip side of certainty is doubt, so we could say that's a humanistic value. But actually, it's a spiritual value, assurance. There's no doubt in assurance. It's the assurance that comes from knowing that there is this higher intelligence again. So it always gets back to, what really is, and what really is God. What really is the good of God, which is the source of all spiritual values, spiritual qualities, and inspired, creative, intelligent ideas. And that's what makes our life happy.
And so again, we come back to who are we, spiritual beings, and the purpose of our life is, in this context,
to be here for God.
Thank you very much, Ruth. On that note, this show is over. Thank you for helping us understand this complex issue about values and thought and human suffering, the healing of human suffering.
Thank you for joining me in this wonderful dialogue, Nancy.
And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.